my own first teacher of phonetics and I share the privilege of having been taught by John. Bev was first taught by John, that promising young lecturer that we heard about earlier, in about 1966, and myself some 10 years later when he got really good at it.
There's a difference between us.
John also met Daniel Jones, and Bev's research has for many years actually centred on DJ. And by all accounts, Daniel Jones had as many and varied interests as John himself. So I think with an insight to what blogs might have looked like in the first 50 years of the last century, we can hand over to Bev, who's going to tell us about the secret life of Daniel Jones.
Well, this paper, in a sense, is 5 months ahead of its time. You retired at the wrong time, you see, John. Because in 2007, a very significant landmark will be reached for UCL, namely that 100 years ago, in January of 1907, a mediocre maths graduate turned reluctant law student came to UC and asked if there was any possibility of teaching some phonetics. And rather to his surprise, he was given a part-time lectureship. There he is. His name was Daniel Jones. You may have heard of him. He decided to stay, and he managed to set up, indeed, a department of phonetics. And that's essentially the reason why we're all here this afternoon, apart from the fact that we're marking your retirement as well. Now, he's known mostly for these 4, I think, well-known achievements, namely the EPD, in 1917, the Outline of English Phonetics, which is 1918. It's really 1919, but it's all, I shall refer to it as 1918 today. You didn't really stand much chance of publishing a book in 1918, if you think about it. There was still a war on. The Cardinal Vowels in 1917, and at least in Europe, though I fear not in the USA, for his promulgation of the phoneme concept. Now, I don't want to play down the significance of any of these, but Jones did a lot of other stuff as well. So he has a kind of secret life, and that's what I'm going to deal with today. I hope the title didn't sound too scurrilous and you don't have the wrong kind of explanation, because unfortunately his life appears to have been totally and utterly immoral. Isn't that disappointing? Let's begin the story in 1909, just 2 years before Jones arrived at UCL. And here we have one of the first books he wrote, which was called Intonation Curves. And in the history of intonation, Jones is rather ignored. There is one notable exception to this, and that is Alan Cruttenden's excellent survey of intonation studies. Unfortunately, it's locked away in his thesis. And so nobody, well I say nobody, very few people, I think, have read it, because it really is an excellent survey. And he gives full credit to Jones and full credit to him for this, what looks now rather peculiar book. Jones was blessed with perfect pitch, relative pitch recognition, in fact. So he could recognize the pitch of any musical note. And he used the gramophone disc to repeat the recording over and over again, lifting the needle off, humming the pitch, and then marking it down on music paper. And in that way, he arrived at these intonation curves, which in fact seem to be surprisingly accurate. It looks weird to us today, it looks crude to us today. But nevertheless, for its time, it gave us some hard information about intonation, which wasn't previously available. Jones went on to do a great deal more in the theory of intonation. He introduced, for instance, something which again seems terribly obvious to us now, interlinear marking, not attached to any musical scale, interlinear marking in 1919. And he also encouraged his colleagues in the British tradition, and some names here, Coleman, the man who really started off the British theory of the based on atomic syllable on the nucleus. Harold Palmer, again somebody who is underestimated, I think, today. Lilias Armstrong, Ida Ward, and many later followers, including, of course, some people who are with us today, Alan Cruttenden, Jacques Winsor-Lewis, for instance, and I think we're shortly going to get a contribution from John himself in a couple of months' time, and I can't wait to read it. I'm having sleepless nights. Right, so then we come on to the next thing which Jones did, and that is the little matter of founding the UCL department. He arrived in 1907. In 1912, he was granted official status as a department with himself as the head and one assistant, a man called Noel Armsfield. This was the very first department in the British University, and it remained unique for over a decade until Arthur Lloyd James, his close colleague, was given a chair at SOAS, in those days called the School of Oriental Studies. After the Second World War, departments were set up at Edinburgh and Leeds, headed by two former Jones students, David Abercrombie and Peter McCarthy. And there's one other interesting thing about Jones's department at the time. At the time when female academics were somewhat rarer than hen's teeth, his department was full of women. About 3/4 of the staff, I think, over half at least, were female. So he showed his feelings for gender equality in a very practical way. We then move to the next step in Jones's credits, his innovations, and that is to say his first dedicated pronunciation dictionary, which came from a British author. I have to say from a British author, because there was one pronouncing dictionary produced by a Swede, a man by the name of Afzelius, in 1909. Apart from that, nothing had been done of any real note since 1791, when Walker produced his critical pronouncing dictionary. And people were still using dictionaries based on Walker right up to the end of the 19th century. And there wasn't much help from the OED because it was produced in the paleograph, which is a rather impenetrable system of transcription. So there was a real need for a pronouncing dictionary. Well, now then, what was the pronouncing dictionary like? Well, this is it. And it looks, if you look, I hope you'll be able to see those, the transcription is very, very familiar. It looks very up to date. But it's all the wrong way round. And what he has is the phonetic version of it and then the orthographic version. Now, it wasn't a commercial success, apart from the fact that this reverse system was rather difficult to deal with. There was never going to be a future for a book on British pronunciation. It was published in Leipzig, in Germany, and it was on the eve of the First World War. It was a little bit like attempts made a short while back to advertise southern Lebanon as a holiday resort. It didn't give us very much success. But it did provide, the phonetic dictionary did provide the groundwork for Jones' renowned English pronouncing dictionary in 1917, and this was really the only widely used dictionary for many, many decades, and indeed, thanks to the work of Peter Roach and Jane Setter here today, it is still around in very much alive in revamped form, and it was without rival until John Wells produced his masterly Longman pronouncing dictionary in 1990. The next first of Daniel Jones is something which I think is very much forgotten, his work on tone languages. In 1916, he produced the Szechuana Reader, a study of the language Chuana, written with a brilliant informant, come author, a man called Sol Plaki, a native speaker. And it's a milestone in tone analysis. It's an achievement not only for Jones, but for linguistics as a whole. It provided the first accurate description, and with its limitations, reliable analysis of an African tone language, incorporating the crucial concept of downstep. And a few years later, Jones invented the raised exclamation mark, which until very recently has been used to represent downstep. He gets hardly any credit for this in the historiography of tone languages. He encourages staff and pupils to undertake research, and his most distinguished protege was Ida Ward, who for many years was the world's, until her death, was the world's leading authority on African languages. Other researchers included Lilias Armstrong, Douglas Beach, Clement Doak, Archibald Tucker, Eugenie Henderson, Jack Carnicon. It reads like an amazing list of people. The first phonetics laboratory in Britain was set up here at UCL in 1913. There wasn't any other at that time in Britain. There were elsewhere in Europe and America. Around this time, Bernard Shaw visited Jones, and the description of the lab equipment is actually to be found in the stage directions to the play Pygmalion. Jones was grudgingly allowed a room by the university and a part-time assistant, Stephen Jones, no relation to him, Stephen Jones to run it. Steve Jones was the man, incidentally, who published a review in the Méthode phonétique of a book on Spanish, written in English, which he chose to review not only in phonetic transcription, but also in his native language, which was Welsh. And this is sometimes claimed to be the least read article in the world. But I personally think there are too many rivals in that particular competition for us to give it any award. But I mentioned this matter to John several years ago, and perhaps typically of him. He ran over to the cupboard, got the relevant copy out, and then proceeded to put me, a non-Welsh speaking Welshman, to shame by reading it out to me in very, very fluent Welsh through the transcription. And furthermore, then the final insult, he pointed there, he said, "Have you noticed that mistake in line 12? In the other things which we can see here on the slide is in 1919, he had a proposal for a language lab, which was connected with a project for a phonetics institute. And here it is. This is the Phonetics Institute, which was planned. And where was it planned to be? It was planned to be in Gordon Square, over on the other side, and very much, in fact, where UCL, the original UCL department is today. But it's not quite the same, as you can see. It was somewhat more ambitious. It all fell to pieces, unfortunately. The money wasn't available, etc., etc. But within this Phonetics Institute, Jones had a plan for what he termed a phonographic classroom, which would have table accommodation for 40 students, 40 phonograph receivers connected to a phonograph at the head of the table. In other words, it was a plan for a language laboratory. It's quite clearly specified there in 1919. It was not until 1924 that a similar but smaller room was actually built in Ohio State University. So Jones was well ahead of his time in this. Once again, he gets no credit for it in the books which describe the history of the language laboratory. Mostly, I'm afraid, written in America, and they just don't believe that anything took place this side of the Atlantic. Another thing which he did is a successful commercial audiolingual course at this time, one of the very earliest, it might even be the first course of its type, colloquial French. He did this together with a man called Émile Stéphane, and it was a very successful work, a very hefty work. It's well over 500 pages, and it has with it 15 gramophone discs, no less than 90 minutes of spoken material, all this in 1927, mark you. So in 1927 this was going out. And Abercrombie, David Abercrombie, learned from it himself, and he said it was much the best introductory course in a language ever written. Daniel Jones was also interested in sociolinguistics. And in 1921, we have inside on the inside page of a now defunct paper, the Daily Chronicle, the first mention of the spread of glottalization. It contains a long news item, an article with an interview with Daniel Jones, under the heading, English as she is spoke in the year 2000. And it says, Jones prophesies, glottal stop is spreading everywhere, not only in Scotland, but all over the country. So much so that in 100 years' time, the word mutton is likely to be pronounced mutton. And he was right. Once again, he gets very little credit, though we did write an article, Inga Mason and myself wrote an article in 1996 where we did point out that this in fact was predicted by Jones. Now, the other thing which Jones did in relation to sociolinguistics is the concept of the sociolinguistic triangle. You've probably all seen this triangle. It's often associated, quite rightly actually, with the name of Peter Trudgill, because he promulgated the concept from the 1970s onwards. But when at the 2000 Henry Sweet Society Edinburgh Colloquium I mentioned it was actually DJ who first thought this up, it came as quite a surprise to them all. Now, the Jones cone first appeared in lecture notes. We've put these lecture notes into print, incidentally. Rush out and buy it. It's a bargain at £850. In our collection, the selected works of Daniel Jones, and we show that there. Now, in 1929, it occurs in much smarter form, as you can see there, in Ida Ward's Phonetics of English, and she indeed, though you may not be able to see it, has an acknowledgement to Daniel Jones there. The next occurrence of it that I know of is in fact in Hughes and Trudgill, 1979, the well-known book English Accents and Dialects. One other point, in his 1927 lecture, DJ states forcibly that standard language is an ill-defined concept. He personally dislikes the term. For him, all forms of pronunciation are equally valid, and one should have respect for non-standard varieties. And this contrasts with the abhorrence of local accents, which was usual in the 1930s, and to a certain extent is what still encounters today. Here, once again, you have an example of Jones being well ahead of others in the field. And this was one reason why I got very annoyed with Tony Crowley when he attempted to say that Daniel Jones had foisted RP on the nation. Far from it. He always stood out against any such idea that people should be ashamed of their speech or should learn standard accents. More Jones firsts. Well, in 1923, we have the first use of the so-called Gibson transcription. And here you have it, now associated with Gibson's name, but in actual fact, Daniel Jones was using something very, very similar in 1923, and it's the transcription, or the basis of the transcription, which is very widely used today. Gibson revived it, and he was quite prepared to accept this. In fact, he says to me in an interview which I have, and which we published again in the selected works of Daniel Jones, we put the Gibson interview in. He says there, everybody associates it with me, they call it Gibson's transcription, but it should really be called Daniel Jones's transcription. And in 1931, we can go back, 1931, we have his publication of the word as a phonetic entity. This was the first real investigation of the concept of juncture, which was a preoccupation of structural linguistics throughout the 40s and 50s. Once again, I don't know how many people today remember that it was Daniel Jones who came up first with this concept. He didn't use the word juncture, but he was, it was very much that this article was concerned with. In 1950, we have the first book treatment of the phoneme. Throughout this time, Daniel Jones had been promulgating the term phoneme, and until very recently, I think people in America thought once again that the phoneme was really an American invention. So here we have his firsts. Now, he was well into middle age, even in 1931, and perhaps it's rather harder to think original thoughts once one's blown out 50 candles on the cake. And so the the firsts of Daniel Jones tend to dry up at this time. He was also preoccupied with other things. He was very much concerned with theosophy. He thought, incidentally, that he might have been a reincarnation of Sejong, who we've, yes, that's right, King Sejong that we were talking about this morning. The phoneme was in fact rather badly received because it contained no new theoretical standards. What it did have was an amazing collection of exemplification, obtained by Jones from his own informant work or from that of his colleagues, and has been relentlessly plundered ever since by theoretical linguists. Talking about theoretical linguists, David Abercrombie, in one of his last publications, drew attention to a distinction that was first made apparently by Ronald Langacker. He claimed there are two kinds of linguists. Some people here may be familiar with this: unicorns and coyotes. He said unicorns are noble animals, concerned with noble things like the construction of all-embracing theories. Coyotes, on the other hand, spend their time grubbing around in the mess of linguistic facts. Abercrombie said that phoneticians were among the coyotes, and he hoped that the coyotes would inherit the earth. Now, Jones was certainly no unicorn. He was a coyote par excellence. He was never happier than he was dealing with a previously unknown language with an informant face to face. And indeed, many of his firsts that I've talked about this afternoon are coyote-like in nature. From the first description of an African tone language to the first mention of the spread of glottal stop. And of course, his description of traditional RP in the outline, the EPD, and the massive coyote phonetic exemplification in the phoneme. But with due respect to any single-horned equines who might be amongst us, I shall hazard a guess that Daniel Jones's practical contribution of observation, description, and classification will live on after much current abstruse linguistic theories and discussions are forgotten. And I think we may say the same, if I dare call you a coyote, John. I think we may say the same for the distinguished contribution of his coyote successor, Professor John Wells.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure you can all now see why I enjoy phonetics so much. It's the most enjoyable talk. Any questions for Ben on Daniel Jones? Jack.
A very slight challenge to what Bev said. I think he had something of a slip of the tongue when he insisted that Jones all his life took a very broad, indulgent view of pronunciation. As a matter of fact, in several books he wrote before about the 1918 was, he used the term standard pronunciation and advocated the use of it. So I think that's a different attitude from it. He had, I think, a sort of a conversion somehow, and suddenly realized, and as you say, he abjured the word standard after about 1917.
Well, what I was doing was, in a sense, ironing over the buttons. So I was rather simplifying things. If you take his first book, The Pronunciation of English, that indeed is very prescriptive in nature. And eventually, of course, he became ashamed of it. In fact, I was told by another one of my teachers, John will remember very well, Olive Tooley. People remember her. She said, "Oh, he said the book should be burnt. Every copy should be burnt." And I think that this was a conversion between 1909 and the outline, because there is no real prescriptivism in the outline. And by 1926, the introductions to the English Pronouncing Dictionary really indicate that he has reached the stage where he says pronunciation is everybody's own concern. He is deliberately not setting up a standard. And from then on, in the 1930s, it's very clear, not just in the paper I mentioned, but in several other papers as well, that he doesn't believe that people should be ashamed of their local speech, and local variations are interesting and worthy of investigation. In fact, a very up-to-date attitude. But you're quite right, Jack. I was simplifying, and if you go back to the original works, then you will find this. And of course, Gimson always said that he still, even when he was older, he had a sneaking kind of respect for traditional RP, and the notes that he made during the war on the speech of the announcers, these reveal that there was, in fact, he did have something of this still in the back of his mind as opposed to his public conversion. So you're quite right.
Yes.
Well, I appreciated your informative presentation. Thank you very much. The photos you presented, Daniel Jones, have you taken some of them yourself?
No, because I never met Daniel Jones, and I must say that I thought that your photograph this morning of him in old age, I thought this was a very striking photograph, and I would very much like to have a copy of it in digital form, if you can see a way to sending it to me. There are a great many photographs of Daniel Jones, and his daughter, Michelle Stanbury, has agreed that these should be put into the archive collection in the college library here in University College, which I think is the place where they ought to go.
Yes, Val.
You said that there were plans for the language lab, which was never, I guess, the Phonetics Institute at that time was never built. Was he ever able to then construct this design, develop this?
To my knowledge, I don't think it came to anything. It's in the plans are very detailed. Once again, they're in the archives here, together with the architect's drawings. But I don't think anything ever came of them. Furthermore, after a time, Jones took against technology in virtually every form. He thought, I think, literally that it was the work of the devil. The thing he hated most, apparently, was the anechoic chamber. And this was all connected with his views on theosophy, which dominated his life totally towards the end of his, towards the end of his life and towards the end of his career. And I had some very interesting interviews with a person called Jean Overton Fuller, who indicated to me exactly to what extent he was dominated by these ideas. And as I said earlier, he actually, I think, had the idea that he was a reincarnation of St. John from what she said. And there is one book where it says rather oddly about St. John, not that he was a brilliant phonetician, but he appears to be quite good at phonetics or something like that, which I think was Daniel Jones being modest about his former incarnation of himself. And that's just my speculation, but nevertheless, I think this was the reason why, coming back to your question, the reason why this kind of thing didn't get any further with him.
Okay. Well, I think we'll say thank you very much once again.